Mr. Chair.
Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I rise to also speak in support of this bill, picking up where my colleague Grant Robertson left off. I cannot claim to have been kicked out of a cinema for rolling Jaffas down the aisle in quite the same way that he can, and so I perhaps lose some street cred for that. But I did myself spend this past Sunday morning in a cinema, in just one of these cinemas that my colleague Claire Curran mentioned earlier on in the debate. The Rialto, see, it's confession time now, my colleague draws attention. The Rialto cinema in Dunedin was the venue, and I was there for a kindergarten fundraiser, along with a young relative of mine, and many other young relatives of other folk connected to this kindergarten. And I think it's an interesting example, because this is precisely the kind of event that is affected by this legislation potentially. Now, the issue we're discussing here is whether the cinemas, the art house cinemas and the small rural cinemas, and also the cinemas in the region, are able and ready to adapt to a more free market environment. And we were told in the submissions to Select Committee that some cinemas had not yet made the expensive conversion to digital, and that they needed more time, and that this protection mechanism would enable more of these cinemas to be able to continue to contribute to their communities in the way that they do, through providing a venue for entertainment, but also providing a venue where things like this very fundraiser happen. The movie I saw, incidentally, was called Planes, a variant on the Cars theme. I won't be rushing back, but I won't be rushing back. Tolstoy, no, it was not. I won't be rushing back, but I did leave with a warm sense that I had contributed to that kindergarten fundraiser, and that I had been a part of a community event, something which it is harder to argue is the case when one sits at home with a DVD of, it could be the same movie, currently 9 months later, but according to this legislation, in future 5 months later. Because it certainly is these popular movies that we are told are most likely to be affected by this change in the legislation. And if we look at the legislation, it's a very simple bill. Seldom do we have such simple bills in the House that aren't members' bills. In fact, some might wonder why we were spending quite so much parliamentary time debating this bill that we primarily all agree on, when it might have been rolled into an omnibus bill or similar. In any case, on pages 1 and 2 of the bill, the entire bill is contained, because there are only 2 pages, as my colleague points out. The guts of it is in clause 4, which flows over from page 1 to 2, and amends the current legislation to say that imports a copy of the film into New Zealand within 5 months of the date that the film is first made available to the public, and knows or has reason to believe that the film is imported into New Zealand within 5 months of that date. And it's looking at the people who might be affected by it. That changes from the previous 9-month rule. And then finally it talks about the date upon which the legislation, when it expires, and it changes that from the 31st of October 2013 to the 31st of October 2016. That is all this bill contains. That is all this bill contains, apart from an attractive title and some brief explanations for those at home who might be looking at this piece of paper. It's one of the simpler bills we have to deal with. But the principle is sound, and the debates were robust in Select Committee, as we've heard. The National Party have come out in favour of market protections, and the Green Party have come out in favour of the constructive destruction of the market. And it's fair to say we had a fair bit of debate before we ended in those positions, and Labor too agreed that we would support this measure, but only on the basis that this is the very last time, that this measure will not be applied further, that this is the once and for all extension, that cinemas must adapt and must adopt the new technologies or move on. There are, of course, other ways to fix this problem, Mr. Chair, which haven't been touched on in this debate. One of them would actually be to make sure that ordinary citizens had enough money in their pockets to afford the price of cinema tickets. It's interesting we haven't discussed that along the way, but it's true that particularly in the regions where many of these threatened theatres are, that people are feeling squeezed in the small towns in this country, Mr Chair.
David Clark.
People are feeling squeezed, and so the kind of two-speed economy that's developed in this country has an effect where a pressure is put on cinemas that might not otherwise exist. And so we could suggest to the government that perhaps by doing simple things like raising the minimum wage or $15 an hour, something that would actually get people over the line to be able to afford food for their families, albeit not particularly glamorous at that rate, would be a sensible way of tackling this problem, or making sure that median wages were rising rather than falling as they have been under this government, or making sure that housing was affordable so that people weren't paying extraordinary mortgages, or making sure that power was affordable so that people weren't faced with power bills at the end of the month that they couldn't pay. Now, of course, Labor has policies to address these issues, and I mentioned in passing the New Zealand Power proposal that New Zealand's brought to the table, that Labor's brought to the table. When in government, we would stop the increases in price rises, the out-of-control increases in price rises in the electricity sector, by making sure that we buy the power at a reasonable rate, at the cost of production plus a fair return, and then make sure that it was distributed through a fair market system at the retail level. Now, that solution would make sure that people had more money in their pockets to afford to go to the cinema. To the cinema, Mr Chair, which is precisely the point I was making, because otherwise we might find ourselves extending that clause 4 again in this Parliament, because people would not have the money to go to the cinema, and we would fear a complete collapse of our cinema system. So I'm simply suggesting, Mr Chair, that there are other ways of addressing this issue. So through adequate wages, through addressing power issues, through addressing unaffordable housing, we could come to perhaps a more sensible solution to this problem. In any case, we'll be supporting this bill because we think that in the meantime, this transition period for the cinemas is a reasonable thing to request. It is fair, they are providing a service to those small communities, and while we're running this two-speed economy under the national government, we'll let this go, but Labor will fix the causes of the problem, and then New Zealand will be better as a whole. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Mr Chair.
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair.